Is that the flag rope you hear clicking, or just memory pulling tight again? They mocked him for tending a stone marked with an enemy crest, the same crest that once stood over his cage of frost and silence. One night he found the old canteen cup rusted thin, catching rain like it remembered hands that once shared bread. The wind paused, then bowed. Still, he leaves flowers there every year because kindness, even across wire, never surrendered. Memorial Hill, Rhineland. Memorial Day, 1982. The morning air on Memorial Hill carried the scent of wet stone and wild grass. Flags along the walkway hung limp-heavy from a night of rain. Frank Dalton, a POW veteran, took each step as if counting distance, not in feet but in memory. His right knee ached from an old winter in 1944, yet he climbed until the broken cross came into view, a tilted piece of stone the locals still called the Fallen Enemies Memorial. He paused beside it, removed his cap, and looked at the chipped names carved in German letters he still remembered how to pronounce. They weren't his friends, but they were men, and they were gone. From his coat pocket he drew 3 daisies bright against the gray morning and a dull American coin that had traveled with him through the war and back. He placed them at the base of the monument, pressing the flowers flat against the stone so the wind wouldn't steal them away. Somewhere below, a bell tolled from the church in town. He whispered, "They fed me when they shouldn't have," and brushed dust from the inscription with his thumb. The motion was quiet, deliberate, more prayer than cleaning. The cracked marble caught a brief gleam of sunlight before the clouds folded back over the hill. Down the slope, a teenager testing a new camcorder caught the moment through a jittery lens. The old man kneeling the flowers, the foreign cross, it was a picture too strange to ignore. By evening, the short clip would drift across town televisions under the caption, "American POW Rebuilding Enemy Monument." Within hours, every cafe table would have a story about him. Some said he'd lost his mind, others that he was making a statement against his own country. At dusk, Frank returned to his small room above the bakery. The smell of bread rose through the floorboards, soft and comforting. He set his cap on the nightstand and folded his jacket so the service patch faced down. His hands were rough, flecked with dry mortar dust from a repair he'd done for the church earlier that week. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the quiet settle, the same quiet he'd learned to live inside during captivity. Outside laughter from the square floated up through the open window. He didn't go to the window. He didn't need to see their faces to know the talk had started. Traitor, sympathizer, crazy old man. The words moved like moths in his head, aimless but persistent. He reached into his pocket, felt the cool metal of the coin he'd left behind years ago and retrieved this morning from a drawer. It was worn smooth now, an edge faintly bent. He rolled it between his fingers, hearing the faint echo of a guard's voice, the rhythm of a foreign hymn sung beyond a fence of wire. The church bell struck 9. Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floorboards where a thread of streetlight cut through the dark. The day had made him visible again in a way he never wanted. He closed his hand around the coin and whispered to no one, his voice steady but low. "They don't know what those names meant to me." The meeting hall smelled of coffee, left too long on a burner, and the faint polish of folding chairs. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sharp and indifferent. Frank sat near the backhands folded on his cane, listening as the chatter grew restless. A newspaper with his face on it lay on the front table, grainy photo bent knees at a foreign monument. Above the fold, a question in thick black letters. Who does he honor? The mayor, a man too young to remember. The war cleared his throat. Mr. Dalton, the town has concerns. Memorial Hill is a local heritage site. Some folks think your actions might confuse the message of remembrance. From the first row, a voice cut in before Frank could answer. "Confuse it!" Walter Briggs barked. "He fixed their stone while ours crumbles. Tell me that isn't backwards." Walter's uniform jacket still fit his wide frame. His medals shone in the pale light. His tone carried the authority of a man who never stopped marching. A murmur rippled through the hall, nervous approval, polite disapproval. Frank rose slowly, steadied himself against the chair. "The ground up there belongs to no flag," he said. "Only to the dead." Walter's eyes narrowed. "You think they'd have done the same for you?" For a moment Frank saw the wire fence again, the snow curling through it like smoke. He heard the creak of a guard's boots and the hush of a loaf of bread breaking in two. The memory caught in his chest like a swallowed nail. He spoke softly. One of them did. The room went still enough to hear the air vent click. The mayor shifted papers, unsure how to end it. "Well," he said, "perhaps we can discuss town permits." At a later, Frank interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "If we leave it broken, the hate stays sharp." Someone coughed. Someone else muttered, "Sentimental fool." The crowd began to disperse, chairs scraping like slow applause. Walter shook his head, muttering, "Some wounds aren't meant to heal." When the hall emptied, Frank stayed behind. He walked to the table, folded the newspaper, and tucked it under his arm. Near the exit, an old janitor leaned on his mop and offered a look that was neither approval nor pity, just quiet understanding. "Hard crowd," he said. "Could have been worse," Frank replied. Outside, the night was damp and windless. He reached his truck parked under a flickering street lamp and opened the passenger door. On the seat lay a small canvas bag inside an old trowel with a cracked wooden handle. He lifted it out, ran a thumb along its edge. The rust flaked like brown dust. It wasn't just a tool, it was the same one he'd used back in the camp patching walls for rations, trading work for silence. He turned the trowel over once, twice, feeling the balance of it. The rough steel caught the light, small and stubborn. His breath fogged in the cold air. He looked toward the distant hill, invisible now in the dark but easy to picture, stone by stone, line by line. He slipped the trowel back into the bag and said quietly, "One stone at a time, then." Rain whispered against the workshop roof like a metronome of patience. Inside, the air smelled of damp mortar and old timber. Frank cleared a long table beneath the skylight, spreading out his worn notebook filled with sketches and measurements. The pages had curled edges, the ink faded to a gray ghost of his careful lines. Leah Kruger stepped in carrying 2 steaming mugs. Her boots squeaked on the concrete floor. "You really mean to fix the whole thing?" she asked, setting one mug near his elbow. Frank nodded, eyes tracing the rough stones piled by the wall. "If I don't, the hill stays broken." "So do we." She hesitated, brushing hair from her face. "You don't owe that place anything, you know." He looked up at her, quiet, for a long breath. "Maybe not. But I owe something to what happened there." The rain grew heavier, drumming its steady coat on the roof. Leah wandered to the corner fingers, grazing the cracked pieces of the fallen memorial. Some were chipped smooth, others jagged as teeth. "You even numbered them," she said, "like a puzzle." Frank smiled faintly. "Every stone has a place. You just have to listen till it fits." They worked side by side through the gray afternoon, measuring, sorting, and wiping each fragment clean. From the old library next door came the muffled turning of pages. Leah had borrowed wartime records to find the names once carved on those stones. Occasionally she would read one aloud, and Frank would repeat it softly, his accent still carrying the shape of captivity. When her hands began to shake from the cold, he handed her a pair of gloves and said, "Line up that edge with the crack. Don't force it. Let the weight tell you where it wants to rest." She pressed the stone into place and looked up at him. "Why do you care this much, Frank? You could just leave it to weather." He straightened slowly, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Because I was a prisoner here once," he said. His voice thinned but didn't break. "And someone fed me bread." The workshop fell silent except for the rain. Leah blinked, realizing she was standing in the same town where that mercy had happened. The moment hung between them like a suspended breath. Frank lifted a cracked slab, turning it so the broken letters faced the light. "This one's ready," he murmured. Together they carried it to the layout frame on the floor. He guided her hands, showing how to keep the line true. "Gentle," he said. "The stone remembers where it belonged." When it settled perfectly, he stepped back, studying the half-formed wall. The sound of the rain softened a rhythm, easing toward calm. Leah smiled, her voice hushed. "It's starting to look whole again." Frank picked up his trowel, smoothing the joint with deliberate care. A warmth rose through the chill, not from the stove, but from the quiet resolve between them. He nodded once, still focused on the seam. "Tonight," he said, "it stands again." The rain began before midnight, steady and fine, turning the grass on Memorial Hill into a sheet of trembling silver. Frank parked his truck at the base of the slope, the headlights cutting through the fog until he turned them off. He preferred the dark. It was kinder, quieter, the way the world ought to be when a man was doing work meant for peace. He carried his tools in a canvas bag, trowel-level small lantern, and a box of mortar mix. The hill was slick, the earth soft beneath his boots. When he reached the broken monument, he set the lantern down beside the stone, its light trembling in the rain like a candle inside a jar. He rolled up his sleeves. His hands, though weathered, still remembered the rhythm of the trade, a craftsman's slow grace learned through repetition. Mixing the mortar, he whispered the same words he'd spoken years ago in a different language to a man on the other side of the fence. "Danke," he murmured, voice lost to the rain. He began to rebuild. Each stone lifted from the ground came with a soft grunt, each strike of the trowel echoed by the patter of rain. The monument took shape again, line by line, angle by angle. The cold soaked through his coat, but he kept working, a faint tremor of purpose in his shoulders. Flashback, winter 1944. The camp smelled of rust and soup too thin to matter. Frank lay on a wooden bunk, ribs sharp beneath the blanket. The night guard, young, gaunt, afraid, approached the fence where prisoners huddled in silence. Without a word, the man broke a crust of bread in half and pushed it through the wire. Frank reached out with shaking fingers. Their eyes met for only a second. No salute, no reason, no politics. Just hunger met with mercy. The guard glanced over his shoulder and vanished into the dark. The bread was still warm. Frank ate half and hid the rest, knowing he would never see the man again. Gâteau. The wind dragged him back to the present. The wall of the memorial now stood chest high, edges aligned. He reached for his coat pocket and drew out a small tin box inside his POW badge, dulled by years of handling. He brushed it clean on his sleeve and pressed it gently into the wet cement between two central stones. "For the man who fed me," he said softly. The hammer rose and fell slow and even. Each beat struck not against the stone, but against regret, against the long silence he had kept since the war. Hammer beats like rain against regret. His breath fogged in the cold air. He stopped to rest, palms flat on the rough surface, feeling the vibration of every drop that hit the monument. Lightning flashed far away, revealing the shimmer of the badge now sealed forever in the wall. He leaned his forehead against the damp stone. The chill of it sank through his skin into the ache beneath his ribs. The rain, relentless, mingled with tears he didn't bother to hide. He wasn't crying for himself. He was crying for a loaf of bread for the nameless man who had changed what survival meant. "Let them never forget kindness," he whispered. He gathered his tools but left the lantern burning beside the new wall. The flame flickered, casting light across the rebuilt face of the monument, no longer fallen, no longer enemy, just names carved into a single piece of mercy. As he turned to go, the wind eased, carrying the faint sound of a church bell from the valley below. The storm would pass by morning, and when it did, the townspeople would find the wall standing again, the badge hidden deep within the work, unclaimed, but finished. Frank walked down the hill slowly, his steps measured to the rhythm of the fading rain. The morning broke clear and cool, the rain-washed air bright with the scent of grass and stone. Memorial Hill shimmered under the first sunlight in days. A crowd had gathered, townspeople, veterans, schoolchildren in their Sunday best. The mayor's podium stood beside the newly restored monument, its surface clean, the seams of fresh mortar barely visible. Frank waited at the back, hat in hand, his shoulders square, though the years weighed heavy. The old uniform jacket hung neatly on him. The faded service pin on his lapel caught the sun. He hadn't planned to attend, but Leah had insisted. "You built it, Frank. You should see it stand." When the mayor tapped the microphone, the crowd fell into a hush. "Today," he began, "we rededicate this place of remembrance, not to nations, but to humanity." His voice wavered, slightly uncertain if the words would offend or heal. "This memorial, once a point of division, has been restored by a man who knows the price of peace." Leah stood near the front, her hands clasped. Beside her were two German families, a widow and her grown son visiting from the next valley. Their eyes stayed fixed on the shrouded plaque. The son held a bouquet of wildflowers, white and yellow, the same kind that grew along the fences of the old camp. At the mayor's signal, two students stepped forward and drew the cloth aside. A ripple of sunlight spread across the polished stone, revealing a new inscription carved in simple lines. "For all who suffered here, and those who remember them with kindness. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence was so deep that even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Then the church bell in town rang once, soft and low, rolling across the hill like a benediction. The widow reached for the plaque fingers, tracing the fresh letters. She nodded once, tears glinting, but unfallen. Her son laid the flowers beneath the stone. A few veterans removed their caps. Even Walter Briggs, standing stiff in his brown suit, kept his head bowed. The division between uniforms, languages, and graves seemed to thin until there was only one shared act of remembrance. Frank exhaled slowly as if a weight had slipped from his chest. He didn't move closer. His part was already done, set in stone and silence. Leah turned, searching for him in the crowd, but he had already started down the hill. At the edge of the clearing he stopped and looked back. The monument gleamed against the morning sky, the words he'd chosen now belonging to everyone. The sound of the bell lingered in the air, steady, forgiving. He smiled faint but certain and adjusted his cap. The sun caught on the brim, lighting his face for a heartbeat before he turned away. The road ahead shimmered with dust and light, winding toward town and the quiet bakery above which he still lived. The crowd behind him began to sing a hymn he hadn't heard since 1945. The notes floated after him like a warm wind. Frank's voice, too low for anyone else to hear, joined for a single line before fading into the hum of morning. Names fade, he murmured, deeds don't. Memorial Hill, Rhineland. Spring rain. Years later. The clouds had settled low again, brushing the hilltops like breath over glass. Rain came softly this time, not the storming kind that tore things down, but the kind that let the earth remember. Leah Kruger walked the same narrow path that Frank Dalton once climbed, her umbrella tilted against the drizzle. The air smelled faintly of pine and wet stone. The monument rose ahead, darkened by the rain, the lettering glistening like ink. At its base lay a brittle bouquet 3 daisies long, dried their petals folded like paper. Leah knelt, touching them with careful fingers. The stems broke easily, crumbling into the soil. She had heard the news a month ago in a single line of the town bulletin. Frank Dalton, U.S. Army veteran, passed quietly at home. No ceremony, no fuss, just quiet as he'd always lived. Leah unpacked her own small bundle of fresh wildflowers, the same kind he had once placed there, white and yellow edges trembling in the wind. She set them beside the old ones, straightened them, and stepped back. The 2 bunches, old and new, leaned together as if exchanging stories. Rain gathered in small rivulets along the face of the stone. Beneath the surface, faint but certain something, glimmered a circle of metal sealed in the cement. Leah knelt closer. It was the badge, his POW insignia, still there after all these years. Water ran over it in threads of silver, making it flash like a small heart, still beating under glass. She smiled through the blur of rain. He really did leave part of himself here, she whispered. Her students waiting by the path watched in silence. One of the younger boys asked, "Was he the man who built it?" Leah nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "He built it so we'd remember without bitterness." The boy frowned, thinking it over. "Why the flowers?" She glanced at the bright petals catching rain. "Because forgiveness," she said, "is just service after the war." The words hung in the air, gentle and final. Behind her, laughter broke the quiet children racing along the path, chasing one another through puddles. Their voices rang clear, alive. None of them knew the names on the stone. They only knew the hill as a place where peace lived. Leah stood watching them, her umbrella forgotten at her side. The rain soaked her hair, her coat, her shoes, but she didn't move. She looked once more at the badge, the plaque, the mingled flowers. The scene was whole now, his work her witness, their world continuing beyond both. A distant bell sounded from the valley. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and bakery bread. Somewhere she imagined Frank would have smiled at that small comfort. She whispered the words once more, half to herself, half to the rain. Forgiveness is just service after the war. And with that she turned to follow the children down the hill, their laughter echoing like sunlight breaking through the clouds.